Welcome to another weekly walk through Daily Doctrine. We've reached week 15, and it's our first week looking at the doctrine of man, or anthropology, man as created and as fallen. This is our attempt to work our way through the book by Kevin DeYoung, published by Crossway, which you can find in a number of different places, and there's usually details around on the website here that you can find. But our aim is to really riff off the book. It's a deliberately derivative book, drawing on multiple sources to create this introduction to systematic theology, and we're deliberately deriving help from it, interacting with it, engaging with it, questioning it, trying to learn from it, pushing it a little bit into the experience of the kinds of churches which I'm a member of and of which I'm a pastor, and perhaps you are too. So week 15, beginning anthropology. So we've concluded our studies in theology proper. You can find those in the previous weeks if you're following along. And this week we begin with day 71, run through to day 75, and the titles of these days are Created Being and Crowning Achievement, Man as Body and Soul, Where Do Our Souls Come From, Faculty Psychology, and Male and Female. So hopefully there'll be something of value for us here. So day 71, we are reminded that man is not God, and we've seen that creator and creature distinction very often as we've looked at some of the earlier sections. But though man is not God, he is uniquely like God. He is not the creator, but he is the crown of creation. And Psalm 8 is particularly helpful there in emphasizing that truth. We are not like all the other animals. We're made in the image of God in a distinct way. And so we've been crowned with glory and honor. God has given man the gift of dominion over the works of his hands. And so the story of Scripture, writes the author, is not biocentric or geocentric, but plainly anthropocentric. Now, what does he mean when he uses that language? Well, biocentric, it's not centered on life generically. Geocentric, it's not centered on the earth, on the inanimate matter for its own sake. It is centered upon man. Now, I think we have to be a little bit careful there, because you might say, surely it is theocentric. We're not suggesting then that God is somehow relegated to second place. The story of Scripture and the plan of salvation has as its ultimate goal the glory of God. But God's glory has been secured in his doing good to mankind, and that's the emphasis that's being brought out here. So humanity is central to the created order and central to the world as God made it. Mankind is not then an afterthought, not an intruder, but a steward. We are given responsibility. We have dominion over the creatures. It's one of what is sometimes called the creation mandates, and that should change our approach to life in this world. So as you think about man as God's crowning achievement, I think need to be careful again about the word achievement. The crown of creation, I think, is a better way to put that. The pinnacle of God's creating work. Where do you think this twisted humility comes from, which makes man an intruding beast rather than a stewarding image bearer? Where's the focus shifting? What's the wrong thinking that lies behind that? Either the elevation of life generally, as if man is a servant to other living beings in the wrong sense, or the geocentrism, as if the world is what's important, the earth almost as a goddess in itself, Mother Nature kind of idea, with man some kind of invader or intruder or destroyer. We need to make sure that we have these notions of not just our human identity, but our human activity accurate. So how can you cultivate a true sense of human dignity with real humility? Because to think of ourselves as the crown of creation could be assumed to put us on a pedestal in the wrong sense, as if we can sort of pillage the earth. As if it's ours for the taking and we can do what we want. But that again would be to twist these notions. So real dignity with real humility for ourselves and for others. What do we need to think of about God in relation to man, and then man in relation to the world that God has made, in order to get our heads clear and our thinking straight in these regards? And then perhaps more personally, you and I could ask ourselves, how and where could we or should we think of ourselves distinctly as stewards? I think it's striking that where the idea of the true and living God is absent, and where the idea of man as the steward of creation and the crown of creation is absent, that there seems to be very little regard for the world that God has made, as God has made it, rather than then creating an environment in which the earth is precious and stewarded. The earth becomes almost enslaved or dismissed and disregarded. So where is your stewardship? It could be as simple as the work that you do. It could be the land that you have if you own it. It could be the home in which you live. Where are you stewarding God's creation? What difference does that idea make to your approach to life in God's world? Then day 72 takes us to man as body and soul. And there's this body-soul duality. We are designed as a whole human being from the very beginning, when God made man in his own image and declared him to be a good part of his creation. It was as a body-soul being. Now, DeYoung gives us a little bit of information on dichotomy versus trichotomy. So man and soul, two parts, that's dichotomy. Then trichotomy, three things or elements: body, soul and spirit. And those might seem to be supported by 1 Thessalonians 5:23 and Hebrews 4 and verse 12. There's a couple of variations on that. First, that there is body, soul and spirit to begin with, and then a sort of, I'd call it a Spurgeonic variation. This is what I think he suggests, that man is always body and soul, but in conversion he becomes body, soul and spirit, and the spirit then is something that is granted or enlivened in him by the operations of the Holy Spirit. So not to get too dragged down into the dichotomy of versus trichotomy debate, DeYoung emphasizes that trichotomy is not unorthodox, it's not heterodox, but dichotomy has been the majority view. There are good reasons for accepting it, not least because the apostolic writers, Paul especially, uses spirit and soul interchangeably, and some of those other texts can be properly explained using some careful distinctions. But what's important for us, less than the are you a dichotomist or a trichotomist, although that's not insignificant, and if you are distinctly one or the other, it would be good for you to know why you are that, to think through the implications of that and what that means for your sense of self and your sense of your own identity. But perhaps more significantly, living as a whole being with eternity in view, that we are both body and soul. And there's a real danger either that we will elevate the one and forget the other, and that the body then begins to dominate and the soul is neglected, and that's typically the view of the materialist, and there's a danger for Christians it will slide into that. But perhaps also an idea that once the soul has been saved, the body almost doesn't matter. And it's important when we think about the glory which is to come, that we recognize that as at the beginning God made us body and soul, so in the coming glory, we will be body, soul creatures. Our heavenly hope is a resurrection hope. Vital to remember that. So, why is it important to recognize this duality of man as created in the image of God? And we've given some hints already as to why that could be. What does it help to explain and to enforce, both in ourselves as believers and in the world at large? Think, for example, about the sense of eternity that God has put into every heart, the sense of accountability, the conscience that is in mankind. And think too about the dangers of neglecting either the body or the soul, getting them out of sync, separating them in the wrong way, emphasizing one at the expense of the other. What impacts will that have, especially within the Christian church? What are the dangers if you go down one route or the other? Then we come on to what may seem to many to be a slightly pointless question. Where do our souls come from? This is day 73. And if you think a little chapter like this is a bit rough, then I've sat through very long, very intense and really quite inconclusive lectures on this topic in the past, and it's been left scratching my head at the value of these things, especially when they just seem to become rather aimless and impractical questions. So let's try and ask, why is this an important issue to consider? Well, there's a number of answers to the question, where do our souls come from? One answer is pre-existence, that each of us has an earlier immaterial existence, and some views of this even drift toward suggestions or hints of reincarnation, so obviously need to be careful there. And that view really renders the body as a accidental, non-essential to human existence. It eliminates the distinction between men and angels, has no real scriptural support. Lots of reasons why that wouldn't be a helpful view to take. Then there's traducianism. Comes from the Latin word tradux, a shoot or a sprout from a vine, and it's the idea that there's a propagation of the soul from our human parents in the same way there's a propagation of the body from our human parents. And DeYoung runs through some of the arguments in favour of traducianism. God depicted as breathing life into Adam, but not in the same way creating Eve. God ceasing from his work after the sixth day. Future descendants said to be in the loins of their ancestors in Hebrews 7. This talking about the whole person and accounting well for universal sin and depravity. And he gives us some of the church fathers, and W.G.T. Shedd, a Reformed theologian, who hold to this position. The third explanation, creationism, that the soul is brought into being more directly or immediately by God at a particular moment in the conception. And again, he mentions some of the arguments in favour of this, that God is credited with being the father of spirits, and the creation of Adam demonstrates body and soul as two substances, one formed from created things, the other from God. Creationism explains well how Christ can possess a true human nature without inheriting the guilt and pollution from Adam's sin, although it's not impossible that God would have created the body of Christ and created the soul in a particular fashion, but we've got to make sure that in any sort of suggestion we make of that he remains truly and fully human. And then the argument that we don't inherit our depraved nature from the physical union of bodies, but because God has imputed to us Adam's original disobedience. So having gone through all of that, DeYoung says we don't need to be dogmatic about either traducianism or creationism. He is inclined toward the creationist view, the idea that God more directly and immediately creates the soul, and it is in some way then joined to the body. But on either account, we should recognize that both body and soul are good gifts from God, in need of redemption in our fallen state, but always meant to be used for His glory. So that's the conclusion that he comes to. So think for yourself for a moment then, why does the origin of human souls make a difference? What do we have to be careful about? And again, we've raised some of the questions as we've worked through some of those arguments. What are we trying to hold on to? What might be some of the dangers if we slide one way or the other? We need to make sure that we don't end up undoing or denying or preventing other clear truths from being reconcilable with our notions of the origin of the soul. More positively, not just the sort of the who cares question, but what conclusions do you draw, whether or not you're a Traducian or a creationist? What conclusions do you draw from your sense that your whole being is a gift from God? That whether or not the soul is derived from your parents or still ultimately from God, but sort of immediately from your parents or immediately from the hand of God, you are body and soul God's being, God's creature. What does that mean in terms then of your relationship to the Lord, the duty that you owe to Him, the delight that you take in Him? Try and think through what it means for you as a body and soul creature to derive your existence from the God of heaven. Day 74 brings us to something called faculty psychology. That's not a board title that you get in a university somewhere. It has to do with the inner working of our immaterial selves. So it's not the faculty of psychology, but psychology to do with faculties. And faculties in this more distinct philosophical language are the power to exercise a specific operation in the soul. Let's look at what DeYoung draws from the history. Talks about Aristotle giving 5 faculties: a vegetative faculty for the maintenance of organic life, and faculties of appetite, sense perception, locomotion or movement, and reason. So these faculties then are things that are taking place in our minds. Plato only believed in 3 apparently: intellect, affections, and appetites. Reason, affections were the nobler inclinations, appetites were related more to bodily or sensual desires, and the Aristotelian line was taken as a general starting point by Augustine, Aquinas, and Reformed scholasticism. So the Reformed typically emphasize intellect, but, and I think we've talked about this briefly before, we need to reckon with the fact that in putting our reason high in this consideration, we don't lose sight of the fact that our reason is fallen. It's not that our thinking is pure and our feeling is twisted, but that our thinking itself is not right. Our minds are darkened by the consequences of the fall. And so we shouldn't elevate reason in the sense that it's almost beyond the reach of our natural sinfulness. So something that is important here, and let me just quote DeYoung: crucially, when talking about our inner life, Reformed theologians have been careful to distinguish between affections and passions. Now, while we tend to use emotions as a catch-all term for the inner life, at least to do with our feelings, I think we need to qualify that, Christian theologians and philosophers have typically employed a more robust and nuanced vocabulary. In fact, and think about this when you think how common this language is for us today, in fact, the word emotion didn't become common until the 19th century. So for at least after the death of Christ, for 900 odd years, people didn't really talk about emotions. And now it seems emotions are all we talk about. You can sometimes track some interesting charts where people, statisticians, are registering the occurrence of words. Worth looking up for the word emotion or emotions or emotional, and seeing how it's come to dominate our thinking about the inner being just very recently. Before that, before the 19th century, thinkers spoke primarily of sentiments or sympathy, but especially of affections and passions. Now, affections are motions of the will, while passions are motions of the sensual appetites. And that language is important because passions, in this specific sense, render us passive. So sometimes we need to be careful when we talk about someone being passionate. That doesn't have to be negative, but when we're using this language carefully in this way, passions render us passive. Passions are things that happen to us, come upon us, and have an impact on us. They come upon us and sweep over us. That's why we have to be careful with this language, because if we're subscribing to something like the Westminster Confession or the Savoy Declaration or the Baptist Second London Confession, then when we say that God is without body, parts, or passions, this is why we would say that God does not have passions, because he is not affected by something or changed by something that comes in upon him from the outside. There are divine affections that we must hold fast to, but the idea of God's passions would be to suggest that God is subject to something outside of himself, which, from what we've seen in theology proper, would not be the right way to speak. So then, why is it important to understand how our inner selves work? What's the value of this? Is faculty psychology, that the psychology of our faculties, thinking about what happens to us inwardly, the things that we think about, the things that we desire, the things that we will, reason, affection, volition, our thinking, our feeling, our willing. Why do we need to understand these inward processes, these desires, especially as creatures made in God's image, yes, but now fallen into sin? What does it mean for us as redeemed creatures? What changes in salvation with regard to our thinking, our feeling, and our willing? What's the reality then of a liberated child of God, freed from sin and death and hell? And then think about your own language. Are you really so sure that you want to bang the drum for the language of emotions? Have you made proper distinctions in your own thinking between affections and passions? What's the value of distinguishing between those, not just with regard to God himself, but even in terms of a Christian's inward life? So think about that language that we use. Think about why the world tends to use certain language, why it focuses perhaps on emotions and passions, or at least in the popular sense, how that language is used. So how often we're described as slaves of our feelings. It's the popular language, isn't it, of so many songs. If it feels wrong, if it feels right, how can it be wrong? Or the idea that love is something that happens to us and we can't control it, and that's why we do some of the things that we do. Why are we using that language, and what excuses does it give us? And perhaps even how do we turn ourselves more into animals than we do into image bearers of God? And that brings us actually usefully to day 75, which is entitled Male and Female. So there's a singularity in humanity. We are all mankind or humankind made in the image of God. But that human race is made male and female. And DeYoung's very helpful here, just runs through a few particulars of those distinctions, the sexual differentiation. In appearance, men shouldn't appear to be or act like women, and vice versa. The man should look like and sound like and act like men, and women should look like and act like and sound like women. The distinction should be there in appearance. And Paul emphasizes that, for example, when he says, even nature itself teaches you that men look one way and women look another way. Then our bodies, not just our outward appearance, if you will, things like hair and dress, but the very body itself. And we're living in a world, many of us at least, where the body is mutilated to fit a perceived inward identity, rather than the body being assumed to indicate our true identity. And rather than twisting or mutilating the body in order to fit some sense of self that could be, again, go back to that inward notion, the inward workings, twisted and corrupted and perverted by the fall, that actually what we should be doing is correcting our sense of identity in accordance with the body that God has given us. We are fitted in our bodily design to our very identity. Then each male and female has their own crowning characteristic. And again, DeYoung's helpful. It's not exclusive, but it is representative, that in the female, beauty, and in the male, strength are crowning characteristics. And with that then flows out a demeanour and an attitude, that in the female there's an inclination to gentleness. And you think of Paul's beautiful language describing, notice, a pastor, a man caring for the flock, and exhorting the church to recognise that pastors have a maternal tenderness as well as a paternal rigour. So you've got this, again, this expression of male strength in action and female beauty in action in the demeanour. I know I'm switching things around a little bit. I do smirk a little bit that DeYoung always begins with women here. I wonder if he's trying to make a particular point. I don't think he needs to in that sense. I don't think it helps. That's sort of almost beside the point, but it's sort of notable that he always begins with femaleness, femininity here. And then eager posture, the work that we do, the eager pursuit of a particular role and function, the female helping, the male leading. And again, he says that's not an inflexible office, as if women never have any role of leadership and men never offer any help, but rather it's a deliberate inclination. It's the way that God designed us, and it's the way that we should go if we're seeking to follow God. So this sexual differentiation then is not a mistake, not an afterthought, but God's good design from the very beginning. So I often say that the woman was neither at the afterthought to the man nor the upgrade of him. Man was not the prototype, and the woman somehow some kind of improvement. Neither was man God's primary intention, and the woman, as it were, made up of the scraps. No, God intended to create man in his own image, and he created them male and female. So why is the battle against true masculinity and true femininity so fierce in our day? What are people fighting against? And actually, we should probably specify the question. It's pointing us toward the answer. Who are people fighting against? Why is there this denial of masculinity and femininity, this resentment of an assault upon the differentiation between men and women? What is it that people are reacting against as fallen creatures against a holy creator? Then think through those distinctives: appearance, physical form, crowning characteristic, demeanour or eager posture, that differentiation between the sexes. How do those distinctives help you recognise and embrace your humanity as male or female. And not just in terms of your own positive thinking about yourself. And it's important that both men should be happy to be men and women should be happy to be women. It's what God has made us, and God has given to each of us that particular identity. But how does it also help us to respond to challenges from others? Because it's not just about how we stand our ground in terms of our own sense of self, but also how we can graciously, lovingly, wisely and firmly address the challenges that come in from outside the Christian thinking. Why is it important to hold the line? Why is this a battle not just worth fighting, but needing to be fought? Why must we go on insisting upon what it means to be made in the image of God as male and female? Again, it might be helpful to think, what do we lose if we lose that? What are we surrendering? Why do we need to press on in ensuring that this is clear? Well, those things will lead us next week, God willing, into questions to do with marriage, to do with transgenderism. That'll pick up some of the questions that we've just been raising. The image of God, what does it mean to be made in that image? And what are the implications of that? We've tried to sow some seeds as we've worked through this week. Hopefully that will come to more fruition next week. But thank you for being with us this week. I hope this continues to be useful to you. Again, do feel free if you have particular questions or thoughts, drop them in the comments. Let us know how you're thinking and perhaps even where some of the particular issues are rising as you work through the text. And perhaps we can pick up some of those as we go. But whatever the case, I trust this is a blessing to you, and I hope you'll join us again next week for another weekly walk through daily doctrine.